Awesome. So thank you guys for coming out to freeCodeCamp Oklahoma City. My name is Carson McKinstry. I am the user group leader for this group. So today I'm going to give a short introduction to React, a front-end framework that I use pretty much every day at my job. Doing it for about a year and a half-ish. So let's get started. Okay, so today, things we're going to talk about. So what is React? What's a little bit of history of React? What problems are we solving? So that's a big one that a lot of people sort of miss. We're going to get into some vocabulary that's going to help later on down the line. And then we're going to see a little bit of code. Some of this is too difficult to actually understand without the code in front of you. And then lastly, a little bit of sort of some getting started tips. Okay, so what is React? So React is an unopinionated framework. It is component-based, and we'll go over some of these words here in a minute. And it is considered a Vue library rather than a full-fledged framework. React is just JavaScript, so it can be used with or without ES6. There's ways to do that. It uses a very HTML-like version of JavaScript called JSX, and uses this for templating. It uses a combination of both class-based and pure components. Pure components also being known as functional components, and it relies on what this idea called composition of those different components. And then lastly, we manage our state and data through this concept known as state props. So a little bit of history. So it was created by Facebook. It was originally developed in 2011, and then eventually 2-3 years later, they open sourced it, which is why I'm working with it today. So the problem that they had is the read state of any messages that you get inside of Facebook. So whenever you're looking on your Facebook page, there's a little red bubble saying, hey, you've got a message, and then a chat message that you receive on in the actual chat itself. So at the time, there really wasn't a technology that was around to deal with that. So all of their stuff is written in PHP, and PHP couldn't handle that. And JavaScript at the time couldn't handle it. So they were like, well, we need to figure out a way to synchronize these two things, and now we've got React. So what problem are we solving? So DOM manipulation, so the idea of changing different pieces on the page is costly. It actually is, it takes a lot of processing power to do that. I say processing power, but it takes quite a bit of doing to do it. So DOM stands for the Document Object Model. So this is how we interact with our HTML through JavaScript. So the way that they actually solve this is using what's known as a virtual DOM, which stores the state or the shape of the DOM as a tree inside of your JavaScript. Under the hood, whenever that DOM needs to change, or you've told React, hey, I want you to change, the difference is taken, and only the pieces that need to update will update. This is going to sound, again, like a little bit like a foreign language until we get to some of the more vocabulary, but bear with me. So the other thing that we need to try and do is create single-page apps. So one of the things that a lot of older websites sort of fall flat on is the fact that it takes time for you to make a request to a server, that server to render a new page, and then send that page back to you. Nowadays, we load up everything that we need in order to render those new pages and just give it to you at the very beginning. So it's sort of front-loading a bunch of information rather than having to rely on something, rely on a server to do that for you. It scales a lot better than vanilla JavaScript. So vanilla JavaScript, building something like this is a pretty arduous process, keeping everything in line, keeping everything sort of at the same point. So using something like this helps a lot. So it also allows us to create full-scale applications in JavaScript. So for a long time, we've had other other frameworks, so Backbone.js, Ember.js, Angular, Angular 2, and then I guess Vue is now a thing. But it allows us to build full-scale applications in nothing but JavaScript, which has kind of changed the face of the industry as it stands. So web developers are now actual application engineers rather than just creating a normal website. And it also allows us to create web applications on the web, so a web app, without having to rely on something like mobile development or desktop development. So we need to talk a little bit about some vocabulary. So this is just some general stuff. So we've got a library, a framework, composition, and a component. So a library is going to be a piece of code that usually has sort of a single use case, or a single piece of functionality, and you normally can't extend that functionality. Can a bit, but normally not much. A framework, on the other hand, is a reusable piece of code, or a collection of reusable pieces of code, or a collection of libraries that will dictate the architecture of your project or your application. They also provide ways to extend functionality. So React is sort of on that cusp of, is this a library or is it a framework? So you can extend React's functionality, but you don't have to. Next one is composition. So this sounds like a scary word. It's an old algebraic term. I say old. But it simply stands for this idea of applying multiple functions in some order to a given input. So if you remember back from algebra, you may or may not, it's this idea of f of g of x. So I'm saying I want to give an x, I want to apply some function to it and get some y, and then I'm going to use this f and call the f on this y, this thing that's passed. And lastly is a component. So a component is yet another reusable piece of code that can be used almost anywhere. So I don't want to say this is a library. Instead, this is more a component inside of, say, your application. So we need some React-specific vocabulary. So JSX. So it is an HTML-like syntax sugar around this function called react.createElement. What it does, react.createElement creates and handles the creation of elements on your page. And what I mean by syntax sugar is it looks like HTML, but the browser and your compiler are going to read it as this react.createElement function. And it's going to read everything inside of it as arguments to that function. So the next one is a pure, or sometimes called a functional component. So this doesn't have its own state, and it also is often used as purely a view-based component. So what I mean by that is it doesn't control any of the calculations that go on to figure out what the new state is. Instead, this is literally just a piece that you put on your page, and it takes some amount of information, and it displays that information. So the next one is a class-based component. This is a little more complicated. It uses, I guess we'll get into what it uses later here in a second. So it can contain its own state, and it can call what are known as lifecycle methods. So lifecycle methods are functions that React will call at different points in the rendering process, at different points in the calculation processes. It can also dictate how and when it updates itself. Let's see, unidirectional data flow. So this is a huge thing in React. So if you've ever dealt with Angular, you might have, or Vue for that matter, you might have dealt with what is known as two-way data binding. So say you've got an input on your page, and you've got some piece of state that holds the value for that. Whenever you update the input on the page, it will update the value, and then the value is immediately given back to the input to update what's being shown. That's not how React works. So React works with what's known as unidirectional data flow, or some people call it one-way data flow. So it only flows, this means that data is only going to flow from parent to child, or from some container to some little tiny component underneath. And with that, any changes that are made to that, to any sort of data, has to be done explicitly. I've got a little bit of code that I'm going to show you here in a minute that basically shows how you do that. So the next thing is state. So state is going to be the local state of a React component. It contains all of the data, or it contains a good portion of the data that's needed to either render that component, or it holds information about the component. Last thing is props. Props is going to be anything that you pass into a component. And we'll see how we do that here in a minute. So a good interview question that I have asked and been asked is, what's the difference between state and props? So what people are typically looking for that is, props is what's passed in, and state is the state of the component. It's self-contained. So let's get started. So what is JSX? So it looks like HTML, and it acts exactly like HTML to an extent. It can take in some properties, and it can also be can be defined by React or by the developer. So on the left here, we have just looks like HTML. So that's an H1 element, so it will produce an H1 on your page. Next one on the right is going to be a component that I defined myself. So I'm saying I want a component named Hello World, and I'm going to use it as an HTML element. So what is a pure or functional component? So a functional component doesn't have its own internal state, and it relies entirely on props to display data that's coming in, if it doesn't already have that data. So it doesn't actually it doesn't have access to lifecycle methods. So there are a bunch of lifecycle methods, in React that basically tell you, did my component mount? Did my component unmount? Will my component mount? I'll actually get into that here in a second. But basically, this is what a functional component does. So if you see there, it is a function. So the one on the right is using ES5, or I guess just normal JavaScript. It's a function called greetings, which takes in what is known as props. And on that props, we've got this, I've lost it. We've got a property called name. So what's happening here is that some property name is being passed into this function, and we are telling React to render an H1 to the page that says hello, comma, say the person's name. On the right, or I guess the left, this is going to be more of a ES6 way to do things. It's a fat arrow function, which is just a little bit of syntax sugar around a function. So I've said I've got a const called greetings, and it is equal to a function that takes props, and that thing returns an H1 with the same exact thing inside of it. So hello props.name, that's going to be the person's name. So what's a class component? So class component uses this idea of an ES6 class. If you're not familiar with ES6, there was a talk a couple weeks ago by, it was Ben Van Treese, talking about ES6 and some of the new features. So you want to definitely go check that out. That's on our Twitch channel. It's also on YouTube. So getting back to React, so it has to extend this idea of, or this function or this class called React.component. So when I say extending, what I mean is that it's taking everything that original class has, so everything that React.component has, and it is basically saying, I want to be able to access everything that's there. So with that, because we have extended on this React.component, it comes with a bunch of lifecycle methods that I've talked about before. So component did mount, component will unmount, and there are a couple others. So each of those, so component did mount will actually be called when React has rendered that component. So it will say, I want to render this thing, and as soon as it's done, it's going to call this function, and you can put whatever you want inside of it. You can do whatever you need. The next one, component will mount, is the exact opposite. So before something is rendered, it will call component will mount, and it will then continue on. And then will unmount does pretty much what it says it does, is as before it unmounts. So say you go away from the page, or you change routes, or you reload the page, it's going to fire this function, and then it'll let whatever needs to happen. So the next thing, you can control its state. So these class-based components contain this idea of state. So here I've set up a component. I've got this state, and inside of my state it's just a plain JavaScript object and the name, and I've given a name of Carson. So in my code, in the code itself, or in the HTML, in the JSX, I've said I want to grab the name off of state. So the state is accessed with a function, or not a function, a keyword called this, which refers back to itself. It says this.state, so I'm referring to this right here, and I want to grab the name off of that. So I can control that state, and I can change that state with this function called this.setState. We'll see what that means here in a minute. But basically, this is what I'm talking about when I say you have to explicitly tell React to change its state. You explicitly have to say, I want you to do something with this. Otherwise, it's not going to do it. Then lastly, you can also receive data through this.props, just like a normal functional component. So I could, if I wanted to, replace that h1 with my greetings component from before. And I could say name is equal to this.state.name. So let's get to building. So before we get there, so a couple things you'll need if you're going to be following along. If you don't have this, that's perfectly fine. This video will be up for pretty much till the end of time. So you'll need to have Node.js installed. You'll need to have either npm, which is the Node package manager, or you'll need yarn installed, which is a very similar thing created by Facebook. And you'll need your terminal. iTerm on Mac is what I use. If you're on Linux, typically it's the terminal, and then if you're on Windows, you can open up Git Bash. If you don't know what Node.js is, so a little bit about that, it is a JavaScript environment that you can run on your computer instead of requiring a browser. Logan Huskins from Loves gave a talk on that, I guess that was last week. So if you want to refer to that, find out what that is, find out a little bit more about it, that would be a great video to watch. That should be up on our Twitch. So to create a new project, so we need to install the command line interface. So you only really have to do this once. So if you install it globally to your machine, you won't have to reinstall it every single time. So this can be done with npm install -g create-react-app, or you can use yarn, and it's just yarn global add create react app. So you'll need to create a new project, which just means calling create-react-app, and then space, and then the name of your project. And then you'll change into that new project, and then you just run npm start or yarn start. Then open up your browser and go to localhost 3000. Localhost :3000. So localhost, if you don't already know, is your computer itself, and you're opening up a port that just allows traffic in and out of your computer to basically allow you to access it with a browser. So, before we get too far, let's go ahead and do that. So I'm in my terminal. I've got a playground set up that I use for pretty much everything. Ignore the man behind the curtain. So I'm going to go ahead and install Create React App. I've already got it installed, so it won't do much. It may just update it. If I can spell things right. So yeah, so it's going to go ahead and update it, but you'll see a very similar process on your machine if you decide to do this. Next thing we'll do, create React app, and then my awesome project. So what it's doing right now is it's going through and it's finding a bunch of different libraries that it needs in order to basically put this thing together, put this project together for you. So Create React App was built by the guys over at Facebook, yet another Facebook product. Yay. And it basically just allows you to very quickly and effortlessly create a new project that you can start working on. So I'm going to change directories into it, my awesome project. And then you now see we've got a README, we've got a folder called node modules, we've got a package.json, which contains the meta information about our project. We've got a public folder, and we've got a source folder, and then a yarn.lock, which just locks in the versions of any of the software that we're downloading. So let's start adding. So in order to add to our project, you will edit or create files inside of the source directory. Basically, you can add pretty much anything you want into there. The compiler will grab everything and bundle it for you. So like I just said, so Create React App comes bundled with pretty much handlers for any file type that you might find, at least any that you might find on the web. So CSS files, JavaScript files, SVGs, PNGs, JPEGs, or GIFs. So the 3 different file picture formats. So the first thing we need to look at is we need to look at our index.js file. So what this is doing, so we're importing React from React, we're importing React DOM, and we're importing our CSS, and we're importing this thing called app. So import, if you don't already know, is the ES6 way of basically taking code that you've written in another file and bringing it into the file you're currently working on. You can do the same thing with what are known as node modules. Basically your compiler knows exactly what you mean when you say, I want to grab something from React, or I want to grab something from React-DOM. The difference, though, in some of these, is that you'll see that I've got a // and that // is saying, I want to grab something that I've already made on my machine. I want something that I made myself. With the other ones, you notice they don't have a // in front of them. Those are going to be a node module that you're pulling in. So we've pulled in 4 things. We've pulled in 2 libraries, React and React-DOM. We've imported the CSS file, so we've got a little bit of styling to our page. And we've imported this thing called app. So the very last line here is react-dom.render. So what this is doing is it's taking whatever we have inside that app folder, or inside of that app file, and we are going to render it. So what that means is that inside that app folder, we've got a component that's being created by React that we want to place onto the page. The second thing in this render function is, it says document.getElementById, and then the root. So in your React needs something to sort of latch onto inside of the HTML page that it's being loaded in. And this is a way to tell React, this is what I want you to latch onto. And this is just normal JavaScript that has been around for 20, 25 years. So the next part. So here's this mysterious app file. So we're importing React again, and we've got a weird syntax for this word component. So what this syntax is telling us is there's something on that React object that I want to take away from it, that I want to use. This is called destructuring, and it is something new to ES6. So that would be something to maybe look at Ben Van Treese's Twitch chat, or I guess Twitch stream, to get more of an idea of what that means. We're importing an SVG, so that's going to be the logo. In this case, is the logo for React. So like I said, the compiler basically knows what to do with that SVG file. And then lastly, we're importing yet another CSS file. So those are our styles for this component. So like we've seen before, this is a class called app. So this is the class-based component, and it's extending component, which is the component from React. And we are telling it here's a function called render, and I want you to render we've got an outer div, we've got a header tag, and inside of that header tag, we've got an image and an H1. And then lastly, we've got a p tag outside of all of that. So this looks exactly like HTML. So React exports a bunch of functions, actually exports a bunch of components that match up with what you would normally see inside of your HTML. So like divs and headers and images and H1s and Ps. And the list is it goes on. So the very last thing, we've got this export default app. So what exporting does is it takes all of the code that you've written, or it takes the piece of code that you want to export, and it makes it available to other files. So where we're importing on line 5, where it says import app from ./app, in order for that to work, we have to export it. So in this case, we're exporting it as default, which means if we just call that file, that's what's going to come back for us. So let's get a little bit of live coding. This is not great, it's not a good idea, but we're going to do it anyway. And the reason we're doing that is because a lot of this it makes no sense until you start working with it. So I'm going to open up VS Code. Whoops. And just to make things a little easier, going to open this in VS Code. I've got my awesome project. Make this bigger. So like I said, we wanted to, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to show a way to start working with state in React, because that's going to be the big, that's what React is all about. So I made a file called coffee.js. So the first thing I need to do is I need to import React. And I'm also going to import component. I don't have anything else in there. I don't have anything else that I need to import at this point. So I'm just going to start building my class. So class called coffee extends component. I know for a fact that I'm going to have a state, and that state is going to be cups. I've started today with 0 cups. So the next thing we need to do is we need to create a renderer. So in that render, I'm going to return something, and I'm going to say, let's make a div, and I want 2 buttons. If I can spell things. One that's for decrementing, decrement, and one for incrementing, increment. And then I'm going to create a span to house my text. So I have had 0 cups of coffee. And just for simplicity's sake, so you can style any element like you normally would with HTML. So using what's known as the style tag or the style attribute. Instead of using a string like you normally would do in HTML, you have to give it an object. So in this case, all I want to do is I want to give it a little bit of margin so it's not butting directly up against those buttons. So margin, and I'm just going to say auto and 12 pixels. So that'll give it a little bit of padding or a little bit of margin on the top, but enough margin on the left and right hand sides for me not to have to deal with it, or it doesn't look weird. So last thing I need to do, I need to export default coffee. And that is done for the moment. So we're going to go ahead and go back over to our app. I'm going to import coffee from ./coffee, because this is something that I wrote. And then I'm going to switch back over to my terminal really quickly, and I'm going to say npm start. So what npm start does is it goes through this starting of a development server, and it will compile everything for me, and then it will basically host it on its localhost 3000. So if you look up in my browser, it says localhost 3000. So we don't see anything on the page, and this is because I didn't use it. So to use my new component, let's say coffee. Going to basically create a new HTML element called coffee, and I'm just going to put it into my code. So now, what's really nice is that the development server checks and watches for any changes to anything that you're writing, and it will automatically restart itself. It will automatically recompile everything, and then basically put that on the page. So I'm going to make this bigger. And I can't spell. So now how do we make this? So if I press the decrement button or increment button, it doesn't change anything. So how do we actually change that? So inside of my coffee.js file, I'm going to close that. I'm going to change out that 0 for two curly brackets. So this is going to tell JSX that this should be something that I'm pulling from somewhere else, that I'm storing in some variable. In this case, I'm pulling it from state. So this.state.cups. So now so we should see that there's not really a change. Still can't press anything. But if I do change it over here, so say I've had 14 cups of coffee today, which I haven't, see it's been updated. I actually can't even drink coffee. So we're going to change this real quick to an emoji. Cups of coffee. So how do we get this thing to start incrementing and decrementing? So the first thing I'm going to do, so I'm going to create a function. So classes take what functions they actually are called methods. And we create a function on that class. So which basically just means we just make a function inside of the class declaration. So we're going to say I want to decrement. I'm going to use that little fat arrow function. I'm going to say this.setState. So what this.setState is going to do is it takes a function, takes the previous state, and it is going to, let me do this. It's a little easier. It's going to take a function that takes the previous state and it returns some new thing. So I'm going to say cups is now previous state.cups plus 1. So what this will do is it's going to give me a new object, the new state of my application, of my component, that says whatever the previous value of cups was, I need to decrement it by 1. I need to subtract 1 off of it. And so very likewise, we're going to create our increment function. Whoops. And we'll rename that increment, and we'll say plus 1 instead of minus 1. So how do we use those? So on my buttons, so like in HTML, there is an on-click event handler. So what do I mean by event handler? So basically, in your HTML, if you use this word on-click on any of your HTML elements, you can give it some sort of JavaScript to run. So it's the exact same thing here. So here, I'm saying I want you to run the this.decrement function. And so in my button, the increment button, I'm going to do something very similar, and we're going to say this.increment. So if we go back over to our page, we've now it says I've had 14 cups of coffee, but I want to, let's try to decrement that. So it decrements just like you would think it might. So you might also say I've drank a couple. So how about if every single time I drink some amount of coffee, I drink 2, or I drink 3, or I drink 4. Or I want the person that's using this to say, oh, every time someone drinks our coffee, they drink 2 or 3 of them at a time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change these 2 functions to fat arrow functions for reasons that are very esoteric. And I'm going to say, instead of 1, I'm going to say this.props.step. So this.props, like we've talked about before, is something that you pass in from a parent element, a parent class. So now we can go over to our app.js, and where we see this coffee thing, we're going to say step is equal to 2, or step is equal to 3, and so on and so forth. So now if I go look at the code, or if I look at the page again, and I start incrementing and decrementing, it goes up and down by 2, instead of that just going up and down by 1. So this is how we use props in React. Is we're defining some property on our class. We're going to say, hey, I want this property to be called steps, and then anytime someone decides to give me that prop in my JSX or in my HTML, it's going to get passed down into this new component. So yeah, that is pretty much the essence of React. It's very deceptively easy. So React it can be incredibly difficult, but also can be incredibly easy to get started. So that's sort of what I wanted to show you guys today, is that you don't have to have this massive amount of knowledge of JavaScript to get started with React. So back over in my slides, that's Slack. So I've got some resources for you guys. So you guys are at freeCodeCamp OKC, so I hope you guys are going through the freeCodeCamp curriculum. So freeCodeCamp has a great section in the front-end library section, specifically on React, and it goes through a lot of this stuff more in depth, and it should make the understanding a little bit better than what I can give you in 45 minutes. The other one is going to be freeCodeCamp also has a guide specifically about React, so it gives a lot of stuff that I've talked about. So why would we learn it? What should we use? I mean, how do we do it? How do we get started? Yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah. Whenever you are doing the set state, you want to go back to that?
Yeah, I can. It'll be, oops.
So it's caps, the previous class.
Yeah, plus this.props.step.
Okay. Yeah. Can you use the ES6 syntax for that? Is it going to work?
Yeah, so are you talking like, say if I were to do equals.
Yeah, like inside that you did function previous state.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of doing the function, I think it would.
Yeah, so the reason I'm doing this is actually, the reason I'm using a function here instead of just giving like say I've got so the other way to do this is with with an object. So cups, so this.state.cups plus plus 1, something like that. So you don't really want to, I won't get into why you don't want to do this, but it's one of those things that's starting to fall a little bit by the wayside. Specifically because what React does under the hood is when you're calling this function, this.setState, it is bundling up all of these changes that it wants to make, and it does them all at once as soon as it gets a time to do it. So what could potentially happen is that, say you're trying to update cups, and someone else has updated cups somewhere else, it could get into a little bit of a race condition, and it might not do exactly what you think it will do. Does that answer your question? So the question was, why am I using sort of this function instead of doing some more of an ES6? Using like an object literal is what that would be called. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
that's another question. The reason I was asking that is because I didn't know exactly what it is, but I'm getting it now. So I can ask you.
Okay, yeah. If you want to ask me that after, since it's a specific error, we can talk about that once I'm done. Okay, so like I was saying, so there's a guide that freeCodeCamp has, so guide.freecodecamp.org/react. That's going to give a lot of what I've been talking about today, sort of why we're using this, what problems we're solving, and then how to do it, and how to actually get started. I believe they actually use a little bit, I don't think they use create React app for it. I haven't gone through it 100%. The other one is going to be the reactjs.org docs. So this was, like I said, made by Facebook. So they've created a bunch of documentation that walks you through a lot of this. And in fact, their documentation is some of the best that I've read. It's the most easy and approachable documentation I've seen. And I've seen some pretty horrendous ones. But they also have a tutorial on there that walks you through step by step how to basically create an application in React. As well as giving you some ideas, not ideas, but giving you some information about how to go about going from, I've got this idea, this website, I've got this thing that I want to make. What are sort of the processes? How do I start thinking in a way to get to that point? And then lastly, so Stephen Greider is a creator on Udemy. He is an amazing teacher. I actually used his courses when I really didn't. I was trying to start out with React. I didn't really know what was going on. I didn't know why I was doing what I was doing. He's a very awesome creator on Udemy that has basically created a course specifically around how to get started with React. What are different things? Why am I doing what I'm doing? And he makes sure to go line by line what exactly is happening in the code. Right now, I think they are currently in the middle of a sale, so it's only like $10. So if you can afford that, that would be great. Otherwise, don't waste your money on $200 courses on Udemy. Just wait for the next sale. So yeah, are there any questions? Yeah.
If you go back to the code, why didn't you have to bind increment?
Yeah, so this is, so he asked me why I didn't have to do something called bind. So when you talk about bind, you actually change for a function. Okay, this could be in a talk in and of itself. So the quick explanation is that functions all have this keyword called this inside of them, which refers back to itself. So you can attach things to it, you can change things about the function. Same thing will happen with classes. So what would happen is if I were to do this, I really hate that word. What will happen is there's actually going to be an error on the page. So the this inside of this decrement functions refers to the decrement function itself. And obviously there's no this.setState on decrement. I've never defined, so this.setState is equal to something. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying I want this to be an arrow function. So basically to get around the fact that I have to use what's known as binding, so whenever you use binding, it is on every single function in all of JavaScript. So I've got a function called greeting, and I do something in here. So every function in the world, every function in JavaScript has this function attached to it called .bind. And because I'm using VS Code, you can get an idea of what that says. So what this is going to do is it changes this. So what this is going to refer to then is whatever the new context is, whatever the new thing is that I want to do. The reason I'm using arrow functions is to get around that. So arrow functions are, I didn't want to necessarily get into this, so I think Ben might have gone through this in his talk on ES6. So arrow functions don't automatically declare what this means inside of them. That sounds like a completely foreign language. I promise it makes a little bit of sense. But what happens is that inside of this arrow function, this, instead of referring back to itself, it's going to refer to whatever it's calling it. So in this case, this is going to refer to the coffee class. Does that make sense? That was a.
So is this a preferred method?
It depends on who you ask. I like this method. So the other way to do this is to use this constructor syntax, which is a little bit more verbose. So this dot super props, this dot state equals that. Let me say this dot decrement is equal to this dot decrement dot bind this. So that's how you would do it otherwise. I just don't particularly like that syntax. It's a little less, it's just too verbose for my taste. But that's a perfectly fine way to do it. And there are still people that will suggest doing it like that. But good question. Really complicated, but good question. Any other questions? Yeah.
I figured out my error. So whenever you use the functional stuff and then do the return, you can't use the implicit return where you don't put the return in there. Just ignore it.
So that's.
Because you have to return an object, so you have to.
Yeah, I got you. So he's talking about right here. So arrow functions can do what is known as, so this is turning into an ES6 talk, that's cool. Arrow functions have what's known as implicit returning. So it means I can do that, where I just return some new object, and it will just understand what's going on. So this function literally means I'm a function, and I'm expecting to return something. It's a good question. Glad you asked. And there's really no reason other than for simplicity's sake. So this is a little bit, again, it's one of those ES6 features that for some people can be a little bit confusing. But it's a perfectly valid way to do it. So any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so let me go back to that slide.
When we compare other frameworks such as Angular and Vue, what is the extra benefit of using React?
Yeah, so that's actually a comment that starts wars, or a question that starts wars. So it's actually a really, really good question. So why use React over something like Angular or Vue? So what does React bring to the table that those don't? And I think, in my opinion, and this is 100% my opinion, is that it's the things that they don't bring to the table that are why I would use React. So Angular is a framework, a full-blown JavaScript framework that was built by Google and then supported by Microsoft in the last couple of years. And it does a lot of things for you. It does a lot of, there's a library to handle dates. There's a library to handle making network requests. There's a library for this, that, or whatever. And same thing with Vue. Vue has their own, they've got a couple things that they do. There's a couple things that Vue does that React doesn't do out of the box. So what React does, on the other hand, is it doesn't tell you how to use itself. It tells you this is how you render something, this is how you control the life cycle of that particular component, but I'm not going to tell you, you have to use my HTTP methods, or you have to use my datetime methods, or you have to use this Angular specific, or this React specifically bound function. Also, the templating is different. So in React, it looks just like HTML. In Vue and Angular, it doesn't. It has a lot of additional things that you have to do on top of your normal HTML. So in my opinion, the reason why I would use React over those other ones is because I don't necessarily want a framework to dictate 100% how I build my application. Maybe I don't like the way that one particular HTTP library, so how I make network connections, does the way it makes network connections. Maybe down the line, there's some bug that happens with this old library that I don't necessarily want to use anymore. Typically, it's just a lift and switch. Typically, it's I take that code out and I put something else in. Instead, with Angular, what happens is you have to wait for that new library or the old library to get patched. So this gives you a lot more fine-grained control over what you're doing. Now, granted, that is a double-edged sword, so it means there's a lot of stuff you have to do manually. So like I said, worrying about making network calls, so getting information out of an API or getting information from some remote server somewhere. You have to do that yourself. But you're not sort of tied down to the fact that Angular or Vue forces you to use their own ideas. So I hope that answers that question. Were there any other questions? Yeah.
So like the opposite end of that,
Mm-hmm.
is there anything that you, obviously no framework's perfect.
Right.
It's your favorite one. Is there anything about it that could be different or that the other frameworks do better?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I don't have anything specifically. So the question was, is there anything that I wish that either React did better or that something like Angular did a little less of? So I'm going to take that from the React side of things because I haven't done much with Angular. But with React, I kind of wish it was more asynchronous, and they are currently working on this. So what I mean is I want to be able to delay the rendering until I'm done making some call. Right? Say I want to grab data from some remote server and then use that in my component. So I want to make sure that that rendering doesn't happen until I am 100% positive that that stuff is there. So that's I guess one of my big things that I would love. Angular does, I believe it does something, I don't want to say the same, but it does something a little different. They use what are known as observables, which you make the call and it's going to wait, and then it'll just go ahead and update. If it doesn't have anything originally, it'll still render, but it's going to wait until it has something to render out when it needs to. That's one of the big things that I kind of wish that React had, but they are actually currently working on it. Were there any other questions? That just went over everyone's head. Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much.